Volvo. A company that always used to be described with words that seem to damn it with faint praise. Words like sensible and boxy and safe. Definitely not words that will get your pulse racing. In fact, if you compared it to other stuff, it would be pseudo-classical lift music, or a nice glass of water, or an infinite palette of beige. Inoffensive, but it's about as exciting as a dentist's waiting room. Yeah, they're not like that anymore. This, however, is the new Volvo XC40 Recharge, a plug-in hybrid that sits neatly between petrol and diesel XC40s and the similarly new XC40 Pure Electric. The question I'm asking is whether this is a logical step or a pointless stopgap. But before we answer that question, you ought to go to electrifying.com and do all the usual stuff that you have to do on websites, which is like, subscribe and comment, and send unmarked envelopes full of cash to my home address. There's also loads of stuff that will benefit you in life, like a jargon-busting dictionary and articles on tech and new car reviews to make you look really interesting at dinner parties.
But back to the XC40. Volvo calls anything that you can plug in part of the Recharge range, so that covers both plug-in and pure electric. And the only way you can tell this is a plug-in is this little extra charge flap on the front wing. Otherwise, it's just an XC40, which to me makes all kinds of sense. A small SUV that looks solid and chunky and kind of upmarket. I like it. It's not exactly cheap, starting at just under 41 grand for the R-Design model like this, and there are 4 versions: the R-Design, the Inscription and Pro versions of both. Now, the main differences between R-Design and Inscription are that the R-Design is a bit sportier and funkier, and the Inscription is a bit more comfy and less flash. So the R-Design gets a sports chassis to make it a bit more responsive, while the Inscription gets the dynamic chassis for more waftability. The Pro bit adds things like heated windscreens and seats and bendy headlights across both models.
And it feels pretty good inside as well. Volvo has obviously paid lots of attention to the things that you see and that you touch, and it all feels nice and crisp and clear without being overly flash. It makes me kind of want to wear a tweed jacket with some tasteful leather elbow pads, or perhaps a nice cravat. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. There's an upright 9-inch touchscreen that Volvo calls Sensus, and it controls most of the functions for the car, and it works really well. Apart from the fact there are quite a few buttons, and when you're driving it can be slightly distracting, which increases the chance of you boinking into something accidentally. Now, that isn't good, but this being a Volvo, there is a suite of safety systems which are second to none. If you're going to have a crash, doing it in a Volvo is a fairly safe bet. Sorry.
Still, there's plenty of space in the back given the size, and even though there's a fairly hefty blind spot in the rear three-quarter, generally it's pretty easy to thread through traffic. There's also no change to the boot size versus a regular XC40, so you can fit plenty of stuff in there. And there's a handy underfloor bit for charging cables, but only if you don't option the spare wheel. Which means that so far, so XC40.
The interesting stuff is more obvious once you get on the move. Now, a lot of these plug-in SUVs actually have an electric motor driving the rear axle, giving four-wheel drive. Well, the Volvo XC40, it's not like that. Up front is a little 1.5 litre 3-cylinder engine giving about 176 brake horsepower, which is loads. It's attached to a 7-speed automatic gearbox, and then it's also got an 80 brake horsepower 10.7 kilowatt battery electric motor giving about 80 brake horsepower. Now, together they only operate on the front axle, meaning this car is always front-wheel drive. Now, that's not really a problem for a little urban SUV, because this thing was never meant to be dragging across ploughed fields, and it's certainly nippy enough once you get going. Like a lot of these plug-in hybrid cars, the XC40 Recharge actually always wants to start in EV-only mode as long as there's some charge in the battery, and it is actually quite a relaxing way to start your journey. Cattle grid. The thing is, if you get a bit frisky with the throttle, or even go up a mild hill, you wake up that little engine fairly quickly, and it is a little bit thrummy. But do you know what? I actually quite like it. It's got some character to it. It just sounds a bit odd coming from what looks like a chunky car, and there's this little engine that just goes brrrr.
And that's the thing about the XC40, it's pretty good at everything. Not super standout, it's not the kind of car that has you marvelling, but it quietly gets on with things without fuss.
The same goes for the handling, really. It's not a hot hatch, but everything points in the same direction and goes where you want it, deals with the situations you find yourself in. This is actually an R-Design model, which has the optional 20-inch rims. The ride on this car is a little bit bobbly on these country roads. I also find the steering to be a little bit vague and the brake pedal can be a bit mushy. But, you know, these are things that don't really matter if you're just sort of sitting back and enjoying the scenery. It will get to 62 miles an hour from rest in just over 7 seconds, so it's plenty quick enough. It's not really that kind of car though. Far better to just relax. There's something quite satisfying about modern Volvos at the minute. They just seem to be a car that the longer you spend in them, the better they get. So initially they might feel a bit staid, but then you become appreciative of the calm nature. These are not cars that wind you up. They calm you down. And these days that's actually something quite cool.
Basically, I think it would be a bit more convincing as a committed cruiser, but it's not something I'd lose sleep about. And there are some less subjective bad bits. As with a lot of plug-ins, the claimed EV range is a bit optimistic. Volvo reckons 28.6 miles on electricity. Try more like the 22 I've been getting. Saying that, it's way more than the XC90 PHEV that I used to have in 2016, because that managed about 11. And a small battery means quick charging times. Volvo reckons that this car should take 2.5 hours to charge on a home charger. On my standard unit, it was more like 2. But that EV-only range means that you'll barely manage the average commute without using the engine. As ever, more capacity will bring two things: extra tax breaks and less reliance on the petrol pump. Because this car manages less than 30 miles of EV-only range, it's liable for 12% benefit-in-kind taxation. Way better than petrol or diesel, but still not as handy as the 0% the XC40 BEV will attract.
So, what have we got? Well, I'm not a massive fan of plug-in SUVs unless they get plugged in on the regular, and by that, I mean pretty much every time you get to work or home. But in all other respects, the XC40 Recharge is a stout little performer. It looks nice, it drives well, and it's well equipped, which it should be for just over £40,000. Plus, it's a Volvo, which means it's probably as safe as travelling by car gets. The ride could do with being a bit softer, and as ever, I'm going to bang on about the relative lack of EV-only range. But if you do use it properly, this is a lovely little car. Do me a favour though, if you're in the market, do have a look at the XC40 Pure Electric. That's 250 miles of range, a 75 kilowatt battery and 408 brake horsepower. Yes, it's 10 grand more, but it's worth a look.
As ever, you'll find plenty more info about Volvo's other electrified vehicles and their competition on electrifying.com. If you do the social media thing of liking, subscribing and commenting, that's also good, because there are complicated maths things that mean it helps us earn actual money.